listening audiences on the Parliament Channel 11 and on Radio 105.5 FM. We invite you to this press conference being put on by the Joint Select Committee on Human Rights, Equality and Diversity, in which the committee is going to update the public on two reports which were done by the committee and which were presented in the House of Representatives today during the recently concluded sitting. At this time, I'd like to introduce the members of the committee. We'll begin with the committee chairman, dressed beautifully in purple, Dr. Nyan Gadsby-Dolly. To Dr. Dolly's right is committee member Randall Mitchell. To Dr. Dolly's left is committee member Vidya Gayadeen Gopi Singh. And to Ms. Gopi Singh's left, Ms. Glenda Jennings-Smith. So at this time, I'll hand you over to the chairman of the committee, where she will update you on the findings of the reports.
Good afternoon to the media, to the chairperson as well, my fellow committee members, and the listening and viewing public. I am Dr. Nyan Gadsby-Dolly, Member of Parliament and Chairman of the Joint Select Committee on Human Rights, Equality and Diversity. During the first session, 11th Parliament, the committee conducted two inquiries. The first was held on support programs and services for children whose parent or guardian was a perpetrator or victim of a violent offence. And second, the challenges faced by persons with disabilities, with specific focus on access to services and employment. So I will just give a brief on the first inquiry. And I want to share, as we begin this brief, the main quote from Shaw, which says, "If we do not attend to the effects of imprisonment on our children, we run the risk of punishing innocent victims, neglecting a seriously at-risk group, and possibly causing crime in the next generation." And it was based upon that type of information that the committee set out to understand the impact on children whose parent or guardian was the victim or perpetrator of a violent offence. We also looked at examining the adequacy of programs and services to support children whose parent or guardian was a victim or perpetrator of a violent offence. And our last objective was to identify and evaluate the current relationship among stakeholders of child support services. In that regard, we would have received written evidence, and from that written evidence, we were concerned that these forgotten victims of crime and orphans of justice, so to speak, were not receiving the necessary attention and resources of the state. And so our public hearing, included officials from the Ministry of Education, Office of the Prime Minister, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, as well as the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. So based on our public hearing and the written evidence, we would have gathered certain statistics and evidence. So some of the statistics we gathered came from the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, and the information coming to us was that there were 34 children whose parent or guardian was the victim of a violent offence, 41 children whose parent or guardian was the perpetrator of a violent offence, 105 children whose parent or guardian were the victims as well as perpetrators of a violent offence. We also got statistics from the Ministry of Education suggesting that there were 283 students on record whose parent or guardian was the victim or perpetrator of a violent offence, the majority of those children being in the primary school system. Now, what we also realized is that regardless of the evidence that we would have gotten on the statistics, there was a data gap acknowledged because this class of child is not actively researched, or the numbers are not actively sought. So those are just the ones that happened to be on record, and there might be quite a number of children who were not captured in this statistical analysis. We also looked at the fact that there were challenges faced by the Student Support Services Division, Ministry of Education, with respect to a lack of financial and human resources. There's also, as we mentioned before, a lack of research on this topic, and therefore there's a very high cost as well associated with this type of research. We were unable at this point in time to unearth any local studies specifically related to this issue, and again, lack of collaboration among the stakeholders who would deal with these types of children. So based on these 4 key findings, the committee made the following recommendations. The first is that research into this type of at-risk child should be commissioned. There are different agencies that can do this: the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, the Children's Authority, and we thought that this was a very important and key thing that should be researched. Training should be provided to the Children's Authority, as well as the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services and the Victim and Witness Support Unit staff to detect, diagnose and treat the psychological conditions of children who fall into this category, parents or guardians being the victims or perpetrators of violent offences. And what we highlighted here especially is that there are children who fall into this bracket that do not present with the usual symptoms of being traumatized, and so sometimes they are not seen as having issues that need to be dealt with, and we thought that regardless of whether they present with those types of characteristics or not, they should be involved in some type of trauma treatment. Another recommendation is that a comprehensive directory of the programs and services of each stakeholder should be published in the paper with contact numbers, websites, social media information, and so on, so that general public can have access to that. The establishment of a behavioral intervention center with input from all agencies with responsibility for children and their welfare. And included in that was an interagency children's database which could track the child's development and treatment across agencies, because sometimes children are treated in one area and when they move to another agency, there's no history and record of what happened to them before that would inform their treatment in a second agency. Another recommendation, the development, monitoring, and implementation of key performance indicators for all of the agencies that deal with children's welfare. Because what we found was that there was a lack of systems in place to monitor and evaluate the programs and services that were offered to children and their welfare. The allocation of additional financial resources. Every agency that was submitted either written evidence or was here at the oral presentation identified that one of their main challenges was financial resources, and so therefore that allocation of additional resources was very important. Employment of staff for all of the agencies, Children Authority, Family Service Unit, that was another key area of deficiency that was identified and needs to be addressed. The establishment of proper monitoring systems to follow up a child after treatment. Again, some agencies, and with the resources being limited, both financial and human, it was difficult after treatment to follow up with that child to see if the treatment was effective. So that's another area that needs to be addressed. And in that vein, the extension of the follow-up period by the Ministry of Education, who said that they actually do follow up, though it may be limited by the lack of resources, but that they should extend that period from 3 months to a minimum of 1 year for the students that they have identified as needing treatment. So that really was the crux of our recommendations with regard to the first inquiry that we were engaged in. I'll now move to the second inquiry. And the second inquiry that we engaged in was looking at the challenges faced by persons with disabilities, specifically focusing on access to services and employment. Now, given that the 2011 census indicated that there are approximately 52,244 persons with disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago, we thought it was important that we look at how the country was treating with these persons, especially with regard to the fact that we did ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2015. And so the committee undertook to understand the challenges to access services faced by persons with disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago, which was included but not limited to facilities, transport, employment, education, both primary, secondary, and tertiary, health, licensing office issues. We also wanted to understand the challenges to access employment faced by persons with disabilities, to examine the current revision to the national policy on persons with disabilities, to determine the status of stakeholder consultation with respect to the review of the national policy on persons with disabilities, to determine the legislative framework required to safeguard the rights of persons with disabilities, and to understand the fiscal framework and procedures to engage non-governmental organizations and the private sector to partner with the public sector on differently abled issues. And so, to be able to ascertain the situation with respect to these objectives, we had a public hearing on June the 6th, 2016, that involved members of the Consortium of Disability Organizations, or CODO, and the members or officials from the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. Some of the most significant issues that were raised during the public hearing identified challenges such as education challenges at the primary, secondary, and the tertiary levels, where there were issues such as lack of teachers and student aides, computers without software that would assist persons with disabilities in using the access to the computers, frequent bullying within the secondary school system, lack of awareness of teachers and students and general public, lack of training for teachers to deal with persons with disabilities in a regular classroom setting, shortage of special education teachers, and lack of technical assistance for teachers and students within the classroom. Some challenges identified with respect to the public transportation service was that it was difficult to access the transportation hubs, Citygate and so on. They were unable to utilize the water taxi service without the services of an aide, and that was difficult to come by. Also, the buses that were purchased for persons with disabilities, the Eldamo buses, were purchased without consultation with the groups that represent persons with disabilities, and so therefore in some cases the buses as well as the service was unsuitable. Other issues identified were that the access to sexual and reproductive health services for adolescent persons with disabilities was very difficult, and so they suffered very greatly in these areas. Also, with respect to the updating of the national policy on persons with disabilities, they were wondering as to the status of that. They were not consulted at the time of the inquiry. Issues with the access to buildings, including government buildings for persons with disabilities, and the building codes that were have not been adhered to or incorporated into the buildings so that they can access them. Inability to access employment is a long-standing issue for persons with disabilities. So based on these findings, some of the recommendations that were made by the committee were that the Ministry of Works and Transport would consider purchasing regular buses outfitted for persons with disabilities, because the current demand for the Eldamo buses really is exceeded by the capacity of the current fleet that is available. Also, they wanted and they recommended to us that Citygate be redesigned so that the bus stops and terminals will be accessible by persons with disabilities. Also, within each tertiary institution, the establishment of a disability affairs unit, such as exists within the University of the West Indies, to assist students and the administration in resolving issues involving persons with disabilities and their access to services within the tertiary education landscape. Also, that the Ministry of Education conduct an assessment of the equipment and technology and the positions that are required to strengthen the inclusive education policy, and so allow persons with disabilities to be able to access the services of education and so on in a much more feasible way. Another recommendation is that there's a training for all teachers that to be included as a normal part of teacher training in special education, and that would include autism. One of the issues raised by persons with disabilities in this aspect really was a lack of awareness of disabilities having to do with psychosocial issues. And so they noted that one of the things that was very lacking was the fact that teachers did not understand when students had psychological disability, and so that's why the inclusion of autism very specially here. Another recommendation is that the national standard, which would allow buildings to be accessible to persons with disability, be adopted by the Ministry of Planning and Development and enforced in all government buildings. Another recommendation that the Disability Affairs Unit, the Ministry of Labour and the Ministry of Public Administration collaborate to establish a disabilities register or a database of persons with disability to allow for ease of access by employers and to provide for data collection and monitoring of the number of persons with disabilities employed in the private and public sector between national census dates. They also recommended that the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services should urgently consider the recommendations and the proposal made by CODO, the consortium, to prepare a revised national policy on persons with disabilities within the next 2 months for public consultation. Another recommendation is that the development of a stakeholder consultation plan to include all disability NGOs and the ministries that deal with persons with disabilities over the next 6 months. They also recommended that the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs collaborate with the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services with respect to looking at the Equal Opportunities Amendment Bill, and they are recommending that it be listed on the government's legislative agenda and be tabled in Parliament. And the proposed legislation, which mitigates against discriminatory hiring practices by employers and the employment challenges, should be reviewed by the Attorney General. So these were some of the recommendations coming out of the second inquiry. And at this point, I'd like to express my thanks and gratitude to all the stakeholders who participated in this process, providing both oral and written evidence to the committee. And at this point, I'd like to invite questions in media, if there are any.
Now that we are open for questions from the media, I would just like to advise the members of the media to please use the microphones. And before you ask your question, please identify yourself and your media house. So the floor is open.
Hi, Kijan Haynes, TV6 News. I'm looking at the support of persons for children whose parents or guardian was the perpetrator or victim of a violent offense. And we look at the incident that happened earlier this week where a teenager would have witnessed her mother been killed. With these recommendations, and she's like 17, I believe, so she's almost...
Or 13.
Oh, she was 13? Okay. So she's still, young enough to be, considered a child, but maybe not as young as some of these studies might be. With some of these recommendations, what would be her situation based on everything you would have heard? What would you recommend happen to her now, having gone through this in her life?
Well, this is where the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, also the Victim Support Unit of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, would be able to come in, because this is a high-profile case, and it's, everybody knows what has happened to this child. And so at this point, there should be some proactive action, and that is what we were having in the recommendations, that the situation not wait until the child goes to school and begins to act out. And usually it's the children that act out in a disruptive way that are taken and given treatment. But there are children who withdraw, and therefore they're very quiet in the classroom. And so they may not be picked up by the system. So these recommendations would be very in line with a proactive approach being taken to that child, and counseling, evaluation, and so on happening at this point in time before there is time for whatever characteristics associated with that kind of trauma, before they begin to cause a serious problem within the child's psyche.
And you were mentioning just following them through. So how soon can we see these recommendations being implemented? So let's say she's 30 now, and would she have to be going from, a foster, well, not foster, but like a orphanage, or will she stay with family? Will she be monitored? I'm using her as the example because it's the most recent case, but should this happen to anybody, how soon do we see these recommendations happening, and how are we so sure that they're going to work?
Well, there are systems in place to take care of children who find themselves in these situations. These recommendations really are a way to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of those solutions for these types of circumstances. These recommendations are made to specific ministries and to the other agencies that would be involved in these studies. And what we have decided as a committee is to take some of our time as a part of our work plan to look at the implementation of our recommendations, because from the committee they flow to the agencies, and it is the agencies now to be able to implement. And so we have taken that position that we are going to incorporate as a part of our work plan, looking back at what we have recommended and looking at how those recommendations were implemented and so on.
Is there any sort of the or else factor? Is this bound by any sort of law, or is this purely just a request that you make of these ministries?
Well, this is a request, this is a recommendation, and the ministries do have a responsibility to report as to the status of their implementation. So just within a specific time frame. I think it's 6 months they have a time to report. But there is no 60 days that they have to report as to how they were able to implement some of these recommendations. But of course, in the course of time, different things happen and so on, and that's why we thought it important as a committee to put it into our work plan to really see whether the recommendations were adhered to. And of course, there are recommendations, and it is up to the ministry to know how they'll be able and in what time frame, because some of them require additional finance, some of them require additional staffing, and these things cannot happen, we understand, in 60 days. So,
Melissa Dasrat, C News. Staying on that same topic, what is the timeline for intervention when something immediately happens, like the same case? I'm asking because after all of that trauma that girl would have experienced, we had the media diving in and asking her, who again, she's not an adult, she can't really understand all the ramifications of what she's putting out there, and she doesn't have that ability to consent to anything. And I would have liked to see somebody from social welfare or family services, arrive on the scene. So is there anything in place for that kind of quick intervention?
Well, I'm answering out of my comfort zone, because as a member of the committee, we ask the questions, but I am not an official of the Ministry of Social Development, nor am I a part of the victim support unit. So I don't know what was put in place immediately, but I would have expected that once the incident came to light, the police would have been involved because there was a crime committed. And from their involvement and what we heard from the victim support unit of the Trinidad Typical Police Service, once the situation was brought to the attention of the police, then the systems would kick in. And maybe I can ask Mrs. Jennings-Smith to just assist me in this regard, knowing that was her area of specialty.
Once this report comes to the attention, but even before it comes to the attention, the victim support unit is called out, especially when you have children who are deemed to be victims of crimes. So the victim support unit would come in and they would call in if they need any additional help from the Children's Authority and also the Social Welfare Department.
Do you think there was any failure on the part of the system to intervene in a timely manner, given that the child was interviewed by the media, probably compounding her trauma?
I think it is issues such as these that this committee examined and we were concerned about in determining the way forward. And those particular issues came up as our terms of reference in looking into this issue.
Okay, and jumping over to the report on disabilities, there were some recommendations for the El Damo service. I don't know, could you explain to me what are the recommendations specifically in terms of, do you need more buses, more bus drivers? But we have gone to many press conferences with KODO, and one of the major issues they had was not so much the service, but the fact that when they were riding on these buses, they needed to have
aids.
Right, they need to have an aid, and they felt that that sort of took away from the independence of the disabled person in terms of that's what they wanted to encourage, people feeling like they could go to the bank and go to classes on their own.
Well, what they expressed to us is that they actually would like to see regular buses just outfitted for the persons with disabilities, rather than a specialized bus like the El Damo bus, which in their estimation does not necessarily suit all of their needs. So they are saying that they believe that they can ride on a regular bus once the structures are put in place to allow them to do so. And that point you raised about their independence, that is something that they take very seriously, and that is why they are saying that a regular bus, just put the structures in place and we can independently ride the bus like anyone else, and just put structures in place at the bus terminals and so on, so that we would be able to access the buses, because they don't necessarily want to be set apart. They want to have a regular life, but be catered for by some of these services. So.
Now, in both reports, you made mention of lack of staffing, lack of resources, funding issues. With the budget expected to come up very soon, what kind of allocations are you asking for in these areas?
Well, I'm asking for no allocations. What I'm asking for is for the ministries themselves and the agencies to, within their plans and work programs, to look at the recommendations that have come out and within their own budgets to address in a timely manner, based on the resources and the situation in the country right now, how they can improve. Because some of the recommendations call for more staff. It may also require a repositioning of staff, a reprioritization of funding and so on. So I am not, or the committee is not necessarily delving into how much money they need. We are just saying these are the things that need to be addressed, and we are asking you to look at it, whether it means more resources, whether it means to prioritize differently, but that is what we are asking.
One of the issues raised, especially in the first section, is a lack of studies, and people are talking about GATE and what we're funding. Are we looking at this as one of those especially important areas where, if you are studying this and if you are studying the long-term effects of violence on children and all of that, that maybe you could be afforded a grant or the GATE or something? Did that come up at all? So incentives for people to study specifically this where there are gaps?
No, that did not come up in our discussions. Most of the agencies do have research units that are funded, albeit they would require more funding, or they would prefer more funding. So really, this was not an issue of GATE or an issue of grants. It was just your research units, what are you looking at, and can you refocus to look at some of these issues, in as much as these issues may be contributing in some way to our crime situation.
Is it a possibility that this is something that could come up where you start encouraging students, grad students, or PhD students to start looking at this and give them the incentives to fill the gaps where the ministries, may have?
But I think it's worthwhile examining that possibility. Thank you.
Since we have no more questions from the members of the media, I'd like to thank, first of all, our members of the media for coming out to cover this press conference. The members of the committee, thank you all for coming out to update members of the public on the two reports. And of course, thank you to our viewing audiences and listening audience on Parliament Channel 11 and Parliament Radio 105.5 FM. We are finished. Thank you.